Part 3. Captain Danny Wright's ship, the Valiant, was running low on ammunition, and even lower on hope. His vessel had taken heavy damage during the fighting, and 2 of his crew members had been killed. His weapons officer, Greg Palmer, had a broken arm but refused to leave his station to get medical treatment. Greg reported that they had maybe 2 more torpedo salvos left, and after that they would be down to just railguns. Danny looked at the tactical display and saw Earth directly behind his position. There was nowhere left to retreat. He told Greg they would use what they had and ordered him to target the alien flagship. He said if they could take out the command ship, maybe the rest of the Armada would break and run. Lieutenant Amy Chen from the navigation station said quietly that attacking the flagship was a suicide run, because they would have to get through at least 20 escort ships. Danny said he knew that and opened a channel to his entire crew. He told everyone they were making a run at the flagship and he would not order anyone to follow him, so if they wanted to peel off and fight elsewhere, no one would judge them for it. Not a single ship in the formation broke away. 12 human vessels, all damaged and all running low on ammunition, aligned themselves for one final charge. Danny said softly that they should make sure the aliens remembered them forever. The 12 ships accelerated toward Dominion's Pride and weaved through a storm of enemy fire. The destroyer Phoenix took a direct hit and exploded instantly. Helen Brooks and her entire crew were lost. The cruiser Vengeance had its engines destroyed and drifted out of formation, but kept firing its forward guns until an alien beam cut the ship in half. The remaining ships kept coming and refused to stop. Danny's Valiant shook violently as energy blasts scorched its hull. He ordered all power diverted to forward shields and told Greg to fire everything they had left. The torpedoes launched, followed by every missile and every railgun round, and every weapon the Valiant could bring to bear. The other ships did the same, and all their firepower converged on one single target. Dominion's Pride had shields designed to withstand weapons that could destroy planets. But those shields had been weakened by hours of constant battle, and they had never faced an attack from ships whose crews were willing to die to deliver it. The flagship's shields collapsed under the assault. Torpedoes punched through its armor plating. Explosions rippled across the hull from bow to stern. In the command center, Fleet Marshal Corthanis realized in his final moments that the Empire had made a terrible miscalculation about these humans. These creatures did not fight like any species the Crythians had ever encountered. They fought with desperation and creativity, and a willingness to sacrifice everything for their survival. Dominion's Pride broke apart in a massive explosion. The blast wave caught 3 nearby escort ships and destroyed them as well. Danny Wright's Valiant was too damaged to escape the debris field and drifted through the wreckage. Half the crew was dead, and the other half was trying desperately to keep life support functioning. Greg Palmer said weakly, with blood running down his face, that he thought they got the flagship. Danny replied while looking at Earth on the view screen that yes, they had gotten it. The Crythian Armada, now leaderless and devastated, began to retreat from the solar system. Of the 300 ships that had arrived with such confidence, fewer than 90 escaped back into deep space. Kyle Harrison watched them flee and then sat down heavily in his command chair. The cost had been severe and more than half of humanity's fleet was gone. Tens of thousands of people were dead. Mars had taken significant damage from orbital bombardment. The moon would be without power for months, but humanity had won the battle. Kyle told Lisa quietly to send a message to all remaining ships and tell them they had saved humanity today. Lisa nodded with tears streaming down her face and said, "Yes, sir." Back on Earth, the celebrations were mixed with grief. Cities that had been preparing for invasion now mourned their dead. Every person who survived knew someone who had not. The victory had come at a price that would be felt for generations. In orbit above Earth, work crews began recovering survivors from damaged ships. They found Danny Wright and what remained of his crew still alive in the Valiant. Medical teams rushed them to hospitals where doctors worked around the clock to save as many as they could. Greg Palmer lost his arm but survived. Amy Chen had severe radiation exposure but would recover. Danny himself spent 3 weeks in a coma before finally waking up. When Danny opened his eyes, he found Kyle Harrison sitting beside his hospital bed. The Admiral looked older than Danny remembered, and there were new lines on his face. Kyle told him that he was a hero, and that his attack on the flagship had turned the tide of the battle. Danny said quietly that he was just trying to protect his home and everyone else had done the same. Kyle nodded and said that was what made humanity different from the Empire. The Crithians fought for conquest and glory, but humans fought for each other and for the right to exist freely. He told Danny that the war was not over because the Empire would need to decide whether to send more ships or accept defeat. 3 months after the battle, the Crithian High Council met on their home world. The massive chamber built to showcase the Empire's power felt empty and cold. 84 warships had returned from the human system. The rest were gone forever. High Counselor Thravenus stood before the council and said they had suffered the greatest military defeat in 3,000 years of history. A single species confined to one star system had destroyed an armada that had conquered 47 civilizations. He asked what they should do next. Counselor Melvac argued that they should build new ships and study human technology and adapt their tactics. He said they could not let this defeat stand because if they did, every species they had conquered would see weakness. Thravenus asked quietly what the cost would be. How many more ships would they lose and how many more warriors would die and for what purpose? For one planet. Melvac insisted it was about pride and the Empire's reputation. Thravenus pulled up a holographic display and said he wanted to show the council something recovered from the battlefield. The hologram showed Danny Wright's final transmission recorded moments before the Valiant's power failed completely. Danny, bloodied and exhausted, spoke directly into the camera. He said they were the crew of the Valiant and they were probably dead by now. He wanted anyone who found the message to know they gave everything to protect their home. But more than that, he wanted the Crithian Empire to understand something about humanity. Humans did not start fights and did not ask for this war. But when someone threatened their right to exist, they would fight with everything they had. They would sacrifice everything. They would never surrender. He said if the Empire was watching, they should learn from their mistakes. Leave humanity alone, or next time humans would come to the Crithian homeworld. The recording ended and the council chamber was completely silent. Thravenus said the message had been broadcast across the entire human system, and every human had heard it. It had become their rallying cry. Intelligence reports suggested humans were now building more ships and developing new weapons, and preparing not for defense, but for retaliation against the Empire. Part 4 Counselor Vethera, who was the oldest member of the Crithian High Council, spoke for the first time in the meeting. She said that in 3,000 years they had never encountered a species like humanity. These creatures had something the Empire had lost long ago, which was the willingness to die for what they believed in. Perhaps it was time to admit that conquering humanity was not worth the cost they would have to pay. Melvac asked incredulously if she was suggesting they retreat and show weakness to the entire galaxy. Vethera replied calmly that she was suggesting they survive because there was no glory in extinction. The council debated for hours, but ultimately the vote was close and they agreed. The Crithian Empire would issue a formal treaty that recognized humanity's sovereignty and established a neutral zone between their territories, and on Earth, Kyle Harrison received the Crithian message in his office. Lisa Barrett stood beside him as they read it together. Lisa said with disbelief that the aliens were backing down and after everything, they were just leaving humanity alone. Kyle nodded slowly and said the Crithians had learned what it cost to fight humans. They learned that humanity did not bluff and did not surrender and would always remember. He looked out the window at the reconstruction efforts happening all across Geneva. But he told Lisa they could not become complacent because the galaxy was bigger than anyone had imagined and there might be other hostile species out there. Lisa replied that humanity would be ready, and they had proven they could defend themselves. Now they would prove they could stand among the stars as equals and not as subjects. In orbit, the Valiant was being repaired and rebuilt. Danny Wright, who had survived his injuries, stood in the reconstructed bridge. The names of crew members who had died were engraved on a memorial wall. Greg Palmer and Helen Brooks and so many others were listed there. Danny said softly to their memory that they had done it and made the aliens understand that humanity would not kneel. Across the solar system, new ships were being built. Not just warships for defense, but also vessels for exploration. Humanity had learned it was not alone in the universe, and that knowledge changed everything. The stars that had once been a destination for dreamers had now become a frontier that needed guardians and protectors. The government of Earth created a new department called Deep Space Operations. Their mission was to explore beyond human territory and make contact with other alien species. But they would go not as conquerors or as subjects, but as equals who had earned their place through sacrifice and courage. 1 year after the Great Battle, Earth launched its first deep space exploration vessel. The ship was called the Pioneer, and it was designed for long-range missions into unknown space. Commander Pete Manning was transferred from Lunar Defense to command the new vessel. He was chosen because he had proven himself in battle and understood both strength and diplomacy. Before the Pioneer departed, Pete gave a speech that was broadcast across all human colonies. He stood on a stage in Geneva with the Earth behind him and spoke to billions of people. He said humanity had fought for the right to exist and had proven they could not be intimidated or enslaved. Now they would take the next step into the unknown. He said they would go not with weapons drawn but with hands extended in friendship. They would show the galaxy what humanity truly was, which was a species that fights when necessary but prefers peace. A species that values life and cherishes freedom and refuses to bow to tyranny. The Crithian Empire had sent their Armada to erase humanity from existence. Instead, humanity had erased the Empire's assumptions about what primitive species could do. Pete said now it was time to show the rest of the galaxy who humans really were. The crowd cheered and the Pioneer's engines ignited. The ship lifted off from its construction dock and accelerated toward the edge of the solar system. Its mission would take years, but everyone knew it was necessary. Humanity had to learn what else was out there before something else came looking for them. The Pioneer carried a crew of 200 people, including scientists and diplomats and soldiers. They were prepared for any situation they might encounter. In the cargo hold were gifts representing human culture, including art and music and literature. But there were also weapons because the crew understood that not everyone in the galaxy would be friendly. As the Pioneer crossed into interstellar space, Pete stood on the bridge and looked at the stars ahead. His second in command was Lieutenant Karen White, who had served with him during the lunar defense. She asked if he thought they would find other species out there. Pete said he was certain they would, and the only question was whether those species would be friends or enemies. Karen asked what they would do if they encountered another hostile empire. Pete smiled and said they would do what humans always did, which was survive and adapt and fight if necessary. But he hoped it would not come to that, because the galaxy had seen what happened when someone threatened humanity. Back on Krythos Prime High Counselor, Thravanus watched long-range scans that showed human ships spreading out from their home system. A younger aide approached nervously and asked if they should be concerned about human expansion. Thravanus shook his head and said no. He told the aide to let humans explore and grow because the galaxy was large enough for both peoples. The aide looked confused and asked why Thravanus was so calm about it. Thravanus said if there were other empires out there foolish enough to threaten humanity, he almost pitied them. The aide asked why, and Thravanus explained that those empires would learn what the Crithians had learned the hard way. He said humans were not the strongest species in the galaxy and not the most advanced and not the most numerous. But when you threatened what they loved and tried to take their freedom, they became the most dangerous thing in the universe. They became a people with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. He turned away from the display and said, "May the stars have mercy on anyone who forgot that lesson." In the Crithian Military Academy, young soldiers were now taught about the Battle of Sol. It was presented not as a failure, but as a valuable lesson about underestimating opponents. The instructors showed footage of human ships making suicide runs and talked about the importance of understanding enemy psychology. One instructor named Vethrak, who had been a junior officer during the battle, told his students something that stayed with them. He said the biggest mistake the Empire made was assuming humans would react like every other species they had conquered. Most species, when faced with overwhelming force, chose to surrender and live under occupation. But humans were different because they valued freedom more than life itself. When given the choice between submission and death, they chose to fight even when victory seemed impossible. Vethrak told his students that was the most important lesson of the war. Never assume your enemy will behave rationally by your standards. Every species has different values and different breaking points. The Crithians had learned this lesson at the cost of over 200 ships and thousands of lives. He made his students promise never to forget it. On Earth, memorials were built in every major city to honor those who had died in the battle. The largest memorial was in Geneva, where a massive wall listed every name of every person who had given their life. Millions of people visited each year to pay their respects and remember the sacrifice that had saved humanity. The Crithian Empire had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years, and their ships had conquered 47 star systems with ease and without mercy. When they found humanity in the year 2287, they followed the same pattern they always used and sent one massive dreadnought to hover at the edge of Earth's solar system. The ship broadcast a message in every language that humanity spoke, and the message was simple and terrifying. Submit to the Empire or be destroyed, and humanity had exactly 10 days to make their choice. Admiral Kyle Harrison stood in the command center deep beneath Geneva and stared at the displays showing the alien vessel. The ship was enormous and easily 10 times larger than the biggest warship humanity had ever built. It just floated there in the darkness of space like a dark mountain waiting to fall on them. Commander Lisa Barrett stood next to Kyle and her face was pale, but her voice stayed steady. She said the aliens were not even trying to hide, and they wanted humanity to see their power and be afraid of what would come next. Kyle asked if the other human colonies had received the message, and Lisa nodded and told him that Mars Colony and Europa, stationed in the outpost on Titan, had all confirmed they got the transmission. Everyone was waiting to see what Earth would decide to do. Kyle felt the weight of billions of lives pressing down on his shoulders. He knew this moment would define humanity's future, and maybe determine if humanity even had a future at all. But Kyle also knew something the aliens did not know. Humanity had spent the last 100 years preparing for exactly this kind of situation. The Earth Defense Coalition had built weapons in secret and hidden warships in asteroid fields and on the dark sides of distant moons. They had trained soldiers and developed strategies based on one simple idea. If something came from the stars to take what belonged to humanity, then they would make those invaders regret every second of it. Kyle turned to Lisa and told her to send out the activation codes for Operation Broken Spear to all the hidden fleet commanders. They had 9 days left to get ready. Lisa looked worried and said that once they activated Broken Spear, there would be no going back and the aliens would see it as an act of war. Kyle replied quietly that the aliens had already started a war the moment they appeared and gave humanity an ultimatum. The Crithians just did not realize it yet because they were too used to species that surrendered without fighting. Far away in orbit around Jupiter, a ship called the Valiant received the encrypted transmission. Captain Danny Wright had been stationed there for 6 long months pretending his vessel was just a civilian mining ship, harvesting ice from the moons. But the Valiant was actually a fast attack cruiser, equipped with brand new quantum disruption torpedoes that could phase through energy shields. Danny read the message twice and then smiled. He activated the ship's intercom and announced to his crew that they were done pretending to mine ice and it was time to go to battle stations and prepare for war. All across the solar system, 23 hidden warships received the same message and powered up their engines. These ships had been waiting in silence and darkness for months or even years. Their crews had trained endlessly for this moment. The Crithians had sent one ship to intimidate humanity into submission, but they were about to learn that humans did not scare easily and did not kneel to anyone. The 7th day, the Crithian dreadnought moved deeper into the solar system and positioned itself in orbit around Mars. The aliens sent a new message, and this one was even more threatening. It said humanity's time was running out and they should submit immediately or watch their colonies and cities burn. The message played on every screen and every radio frequency. People on Earth looked up at the night sky and wondered if they would survive the next few days. Kyle Harrison stood in front of cameras and broadcast humanity's response. The transmission went out on every frequency in every direction, so the whole galaxy could hear what he said. Kyle looked directly into the camera and spoke with a voice that did not shake. He told the Crithian Empire that humanity does not kneel to tyrants and never would. He invited them to come and try to make humanity submit if they thought they could. The message ended and Kyle knew there was no turning back now. 3 hours later, the Crithian dreadnought began moving toward Earth at high speed. The alien ship's weapons came online and started targeting human satellites and orbital stations. But the humans had been counting down every second and were ready. From their hiding spots behind the asteroid belt, 12 destroyers suddenly appeared and moved into coordinated attack formations that they had practiced 1,000 times. Danny Wright's voice came over the fleet communication channel clear and calm. He told all ships to engage the enemy and target their weapon systems first, because if they could make the aliens blind, then they could make them bleed. The Valiant fired first, and 6 quantum disruption torpedoes streaked through space invisible to the alien sensors. The weapons hit the dreadnought's starboard side, and the alien shields flickered and failed in several spots. the Crithians had never encountered, weapons that could phase right through their energy barriers. Lieutenant Greg Palmer called out from his weapon station that they had scored direct hits and the enemy shields were not adapting to compensate. Danny told him to fire again immediately and not give the aliens any time to figure out what was happening. More torpedoes launched and more sections of the dreadnought's shields collapsed. The alien ship began to turn and tried to bring more weapons to bear on the attacking human ships. The dreadnought fired back with massive beams of superheated plasma that cut through space like blades of light. One beam caught the destroyer Ranger and punched straight through its hull. The ship exploded in a ball of fire and 70 human lives ended in less than a second. Lisa reported from Earth Command that Ranger was gone, but they had done real damage and the alien shields were now down to 60% strength. Kyle ordered the second wave to deploy and attack from below. 8 more ships emerged from where they had been hiding in the shadow of Mars. They came at the dreadnought from an unexpected angle and forced it to split its defensive fire between 2 directions. Commander Helen Brooks led this second wave in her ship, the Defiant. She smiled grimly as her vessel reached weapons range. She said over the comm that the aliens had built their empire by making others afraid, and now it was time to teach them what real fear felt. Like, all the human ships opened fire at once, and the concentrated firepower overwhelmed the dreadnought. As defensive systems, torpedoes slammed into the massive engines at the rear of the ship. Railgun slugs traveling at tremendous speeds punched holes through armor plating that was already weakened. The alien vessel began to list sideways and could not maintain its position anymore. Inside the Crithian dreadnought, Supreme Commander Velthor gripped his command throne as the entire ship shook and alarms blared. He shouted at his crew and demanded to know how these primitive humans were doing this. Their technology should not be advanced enough to breach Crithian shields. A younger officer named Morthak looked up from his station with fear in his eyes. He said the humans knew exactly where to strike, and this was all carefully planned. The humans had been waiting and preparing for the Crithians to arrive. Velthor felt ice-cold fear run through his body, because in 3,000 years of conquest, no species had ever been ready and waiting. Every other civilization had been surprised and overwhelmed. He gave the order to send out a distress signal calling for the full Armada to come immediately. The message went out across faster-than-light communication channels and reached the Crithian home fleet 16 light-years away. It was a message that had never been sent before in the entire history of the Empire. It simply said, "Send all reinforcements because we are losing." The human fleet pressed their advantage and did not let up. Danny Wright brought the Valiant around for another attack run. His targeting officer locked onto the dreadnought's main power core. Greg Palmer reported target acquired and fired the last of their torpedoes. The weapons struck true and penetrated deep into the alien ship's power systems. For a moment nothing happened, and then the dreadnought exploded in a massive cascade of secondary detonations. The ship broke into huge pieces that tumbled through space, glowing red hot. Kyle Harrison stood in the command center and watched in silence as the debris spread across his tactical display. After a long moment he spoke softly and told the fleet they had done well, but this was only the beginning. If the Crithians were anything like humans, they would not accept this defeat quietly. They would send more ships and bigger fleets. Kyle was absolutely right, because the Empire's response was already in motion. 300 warships, the largest armada ever assembled, began preparing for immediate departure. The Empire would send their best warriors and most powerful weapons and enough ships to block out the stars themselves. They had no idea what humanity had waiting for them. Part 5 years after the Great Battle, humanity had changed in ways no one could have predicted. The war with the Crithian Empire had forced rapid technological advancement and social unity. Nations that had competed for centuries now worked together as one species with one purpose, which was survival and prosperity among the stars. The Pioneer returned from its first deep space mission with incredible news. Commander Pete Manning reported that they had made contact with 3 different alien species, and none of them were hostile. 2 were peaceful trading civilizations, and 1 was a small empire that had also fought the Crithians centuries ago and lost. When that empire learned humans had defeated a Crithian armada, they immediately requested an alliance. Kyle Harrison, who was now Fleet Admiral of all human forces, met with the alien ambassadors. The meeting took place on a neutral space station that humanity had built at the edge of their territory. The station was called Unity, and it represented humanity's hope for peaceful coexistence with other species. The ambassador from the Velkin people was a tall insectoid creature named Shavak. She told Kyle that her species had been conquered by the Krithians 800 years ago and had lived under occupation ever since. When news spread that humans had destroyed a Krithian armada, her people had begun to hope that freedom might be possible. She asked if humanity would help liberate her people. Kyle considered the request carefully. He knew that getting involved in another war so soon after their own battle was risky, but he also knew that humanity had fought for freedom, and it would be hypocritical to deny that same freedom to others. He told Shavak that humanity would help, but they would need time to prepare and gather intelligence about Krithian occupation. Forces. Lisa Barrett, who was now a general in the Earth Defense Coalition, led the intelligence-gathering operation. She sent small stealth ships into Velkin space to observe the Krithian garrison forces. What they found surprised everyone. The garrison was small with only 20 warships, and the Krithians seemed to rely more on fear and reputation than actual military strength. Danny Wright, who had been promoted to admiral, was given command of the Liberation Fleet. His flagship was the new Valiant, which had been completely rebuilt and was now twice as powerful as the original. He assembled a force of 30 ships and made plans for a quick strike that would catch the Krithians by surprise. The liberation of Velkin space took only 3 days. The Krithian garrison was unprepared for human tactics and weapons. Danny's fleet used the same quantum disruption torpedoes that had proven so effective in the Battle of Sol. The Krithian ships tried to fight but were overwhelmed quickly. 15 were destroyed and 5 surrendered. The remaining ships fled back to Krithian space. The Velkin people celebrated their freedom with massive gatherings in every city. Shavak met with Danny and Kyle and thanked them with tears in her compound eyes. She said her people had waited 8 centuries for this moment and would never forget what humanity had done. Kyle told her that all species deserved freedom and humanity was honored to help achieve it. News of the Velkin liberation spread quickly across the galaxy. Other species that lived under Krithian occupation began to reach out to humanity and ask for help. The Krithian Empire suddenly found itself facing rebellions in multiple systems. High Counselor Thravenus called an emergency meeting of the Council. He told them that the Empire was at a crossroads. They could continue trying to hold their conquests through force, which would mean constant warfare with humanity and their growing alliance, or they could acknowledge that the age of conquest was over and begin withdrawing from occupied territories. The debate was intense, but ultimately practical concerns won out. The Krithian Empire announced it would begin a gradual withdrawal from all occupied systems over the next 10 years. It was an unprecedented decision that shocked the entire galaxy. Some within the Empire saw it as shameful surrender. Others, including Thravenus, saw it as necessary evolution. The Empire would survive by adapting and becoming something new. On Earth, the news was received with cautious optimism. Kyle gave a speech in which he said humanity had not set out to dismantle an empire, but to defend their home. However, now that they had become a galactic power, they had a responsibility to stand for the values they held dear: freedom and dignity and the right of all species to determine their own fate. He announced the formation of the Free Systems Alliance, which would be a coalition of independent species committed to mutual defense and cooperation. Membership would be voluntary, and all members would have equal say regardless of their size or military strength. The alliance would not seek to conquer or dominate, but to protect and preserve freedom. 20 species joined the alliance in its first year. The Velkin were among the founding members, along with several other species that had been liberated from Krithian rule. Even some Krithian colonies that had been far from the home world and felt abandoned chose to join as independent systems. Danny Wright was appointed as the first Supreme Commander of Alliance forces. It was a position that came with enormous responsibility. He would coordinate defense strategies across dozens of systems and multiple species. But Danny accepted the role because he understood that the safety humanity had won could only be maintained through cooperation and vigilance. The Alliance established rules of engagement that all members had to follow. Military force could only be used in self-defense or to liberate occupied peoples who requested help. No member could conquer another species or claim territory by force. Trade disputes would be settled through arbitration, not warfare. It was idealistic, but everyone agreed it was worth trying. Greg Palmer, who had lost his arm in the Battle of Sol, now wore an advanced prosthetic that was better than his original limb. He became an instructor at the New Alliance Military Academy, where soldiers from multiple species trained together. He taught classes on human tactics and often told his students that the secret to humanity's victory was not superior technology but superior determination. He would say that any species could build powerful weapons, but not every species had the will to use them when the cost was total sacrifice. That willingness to give everything for what you believed in was what made humans dangerous. But he always added that the same determination that made humans deadly in war also made them loyal in peace. When humans made friends, they were friends for life. Karen White became the captain of a new exploration ship called the Frontier. Her mission was to travel beyond known space and make contact with species that had never encountered galactic civilization. It was dangerous work because there was no way to know if new species would be friendly or hostile, but Karen believed it was important to extend the hand of friendship before someone else extended a fist. Pete Manning retired from active service, but stayed involved as an advisor to the Alliance Council. He spent his time writing a book about the war with the Crithians and the formation of the Alliance. The book became required reading in schools across dozens of worlds. Young people of many species read about how humanity had stood alone against an empire and won through courage and sacrifice. Amy Chen became Earth's ambassador to the Crithian homeworld. It was a controversial appointment because many humans still held grudges against the empire. But Amy argued that peace required understanding, and someone needed to build bridges between former enemies. She moved to Krythos Prime and worked to establish cultural exchanges and trade agreements. Thravanus met with Amy regularly, and the two developed a mutual respect. He told her once that she reminded him of the humans he had seen in battle footage. Determined and unwilling to give up even when facing impossible odds, Amy took it as a compliment and said, "Those same qualities could be used to build peace as effectively as they had been used to wage war." 20 years after the Battle of Sol, humanity celebrated the anniversary, with ceremonies across all their worlds. Veterans of the battle were honored, and the names of the dead were read aloud. Children who had not been born when the war happened learned about the sacrifice their parents and grandparents had made. Kyle Harrison, now elderly and retired, stood at the memorial wall in Geneva. He ran his fingers over the engraved names and remembered each person. Lisa stood beside him, also older but still strong. She said quietly that they had built something good from the ashes of war. Kyle agreed and said the Alliance proved that different species could work together and that cooperation was stronger than conquest. Danny Wright visited the grave of Helen Brooks, who had died in the Battle of Sol. He placed flowers and spoke to her memory. He told her about the Alliance and how humanity had helped liberate multiple species. He said he thought she would be proud of what they had accomplished. The sacrifice had not been in vain. In orbit above Earth, construction was underway on the largest ship ever built. It was called the Enterprise and would serve as the mobile headquarters for Alliance forces. The ship was a joint project with engineers and workers from 15 different species. It symbolized the unity and cooperation that the Alliance represented. The galaxy had changed forever because of one species that refused to kneel. Humanity had proven that size and age of an empire meant nothing compared to determination and will. Part 262 days after the Crithian dreadnought was destroyed, the alien Armada arrived at the edge of humanity's solar system. 300 warships appeared out of faster-than-light travel and spread across space in a formation that had conquered entire civilizations. The ships ranged from massive carriers to swift interceptors, and they moved with practiced precision. On Earth, every alarm system activated at once, and Lisa Barrett announced to Admiral Kyle Harrison that the aliens were here. She said 300 military vessels had appeared and were forming an attack formation. Kyle stared at the tactical display where red dots showed the enemy positions, and they outnumbered humanity's entire fleet by 15 to 1. He ordered all colonies to evacuate civilians to underground bunkers and told his staff to activate all defense platforms and get Captain Danny Wright on the communication screen. Danny appeared and his face was grim, but he looked determined. He said he could see the Armada, and so could everyone else in the fleet. Kyle told him honestly that the odds were not in humanity's favor. Danny replied with respect that odds were for people who did not know how to cheat. He said humanity had been preparing for this, and every ship and weapon and soldier knew what was at stake. They were not fighting for territory or resources, but for the right to exist. Kyle felt pride rise in his chest and told Danny to give them hell. The Crythian Armada began moving forward in perfect synchronization. At the center of the formation was the massive flagship called Dominion's Pride, where Fleet Marshal Corthanus reviewed the tactical situation. The loss of the first dreadnought had been unexpected, but 300 ships would correct that mistake easily. He ordered his fleet to begin the assault and destroy the outer defense stations first and then move toward Earth and show the humans the price of resistance. The Armada's weapons charged and prepared to unleash destruction, but humanity had spent 2 months doing more than just waiting. Kyle gave the order to activate the minefield. Across 3 million kilometers, thousands of stealth mines came online. They had been placed by automated drones and were invisible to sensors until they armed themselves. The Crythian Armada, advancing in tight formation, sailed directly into the trap. The explosions came in. Waves and ships at the edges of the formation took critical damage as their shields were overwhelmed by multiple mines detonating at once. 23 Crythian vessels were destroyed in the first 90 seconds. Lisa reported that the aliens were breaking formation because the mines had disrupted their coordination. Kyle said now was the time and ordered humanity to launch everything they had. From hidden positions all over the solar system, the entire human fleet emerged. Every ship and fighter and weapon platform that could fly came screaming toward the confused alien armada. Danny Wright led the charge in the Valiant and told all ships that target selection was free and they should find something big and hurt it badly. The battle turned into chaos as human ships weaved between the larger alien vessels. Fighters launched in huge swarms and their pilots were trained to make suicide runs if necessary. Quantum disruption torpedoes tore through shields that had been considered impenetrable by every species the Crythians had ever fought. Commander Helen Brooks commanded a new destroyer called the Phoenix and coordinated 5 ships in an attack on a Crythian carrier. She told her group to focus fire on the launch bays because if they stopped the aliens from deploying fighters, they would cut the enemy's tactical advantage. The Phoenix and her sister ships hammered the carrier with everything they had. Railgun rounds punched through armor and missiles overwhelmed the point defense systems. The carrier's launch bay erupted in flames and trapped hundreds of alien fighters inside. But humanity was paying a heavy price for every victory. For each Crythian ship destroyed, 2 or 3 human vessels were lost. The destroyer Thunder exploded under concentrated plasma fire. The cruiser Hammer broke apart when a shot hit its reactor core. Names and faces that Kyle had known for years disappeared from his tactical displays. On Mars, the defensive platforms added their firepower to the battle. Massive railguns built into the planet's surface fired slugs the size of buildings into space. One shot caught a Crythian battleship at the perfect angle, and the kinetic impact shattered the alien vessel like glass. Aboard Dominion's Pride fleet, Marshal Corthanus struggled to maintain control of the battle. He shouted and asked how the humans were doing this because they were outnumbered and outgunned, but they fought like demons. Morthak, who had survived the first battle, spoke quietly and said the humans were not fighting to conquer, but to survive. And there was a difference. Corthanus snarled and said they would show the humans that survival was not an option. He ordered all ships to converge on Earth and said they would burn the human homeworld to ash. The order would be the Empire's greatest mistake. The remaining Crythian ships, over 200 of them, began pushing toward Earth. They left behind wreckage from both fleets, including shattered hulls and frozen bodies and debris from 2 civilizations in violent collision. Kyle asked about the status of the lunar batteries, and Lisa told him they were charged and ready. She said once they fired, the moon's power grid would be offline for weeks and they would only get 1 shot with each battery. Kyle said they had better make every shot count. He opened a channel to the lunar defense commander, Colonel Pete Manning, and told him he was cleared to fire at his discretion on the far side of the moon, hidden beneath fake craters and false mining operations. Humanity had built its most powerful weapons. Massive energy cannons drew power from fusion reactors deep underground. They had been constructed in secret over 20 years based on theoretical physics that most scientists said was impossible. Pete Manning stood in the fire control center and announced that target locks were acquired and firing solutions were calculated. He ordered all batteries to fire. 6 beams of concentrated energy lanced across space, and each beam carried enough power to vaporize a small asteroid. They moved at light speed, which made them impossible to dodge or avoid. 3 Crythian battleships simply ceased to exist because their shields and armor meant nothing against such raw power. Pete calmly ordered his crew to reload and fire again and keep firing until they ran out of power or the aliens were all dead. The lunar batteries fired 4 more times before their reserves were empty. Each salvo destroyed multiple ships, and the Krithian advance slowed and faltered, but they kept coming toward Earth.